Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
Christmas is supposed to be the one day a year when everything slows down, when even the messiest families sit around a table, pretending that mashed potatoes and wine can cover up years of silent disappointments and unspoken grudges. It's a day for bad sweaters, worse jokes, and pretending the old wounds don't itch beneath the surface. But this year, in the glow of a carefully decorated fake tree and the faint scent of pine-scented candles that were trying too hard, my father decided to rip off every Band-Aid we'd all silently agreed to keep on. He did it with a smile, of course, and a goddamn whiskey glass in hand. We were halfway through dinner, plates half empty, gravy cooling on green beans no one really wanted, when he stood up, fork still in his hand like it was a pointer in some smug lecture he'd been dying to give. He raised his glass and said, with a chuckle that tried to pass as light-hearted but carried years of meaning, "I just want to say this now. Only one of my kids actually turned out right." The room froze, not in shock, no, this was Henry Allen we were talking about, a man who believed brutal honesty made him righteous, not cruel, but because everyone instantly knew who he meant. Eyes turned, not subtly, toward my brother Jake, who was already grinning like he'd just been knighted. He shrugged modestly, shaking his head as if to say, come on, Dad," but he wasn't fooling anyone. He sat there in his tailored blazer and crisp button-down shirt, looking like every magazine ad for successful, dependable sons, the kind who remember birthdays and help Dad set up the new router. His wife Melissa gave him that soft-eyed look like she'd hit the jackpot, and even my stepmother Janice gave a little nod of agreement, as if this declaration was long overdue. I sat there with my mouth full of dry turkey and the bitter taste of every time I'd been made to feel like a footnote in my own family. My younger cousin Danny shifted awkwardly beside me, probably wondering if he should say something. He didn't. No one ever did. My daughter, Sophie, looked at me with a wrinkle between her brows, sensing something but too young to put her finger on it. She'd grown up watching me be the one who never quite measured up, not as polished as Jake, not as pliant as the rest. I took a sip of water to clear my throat and bought myself 3 more seconds to decide. And then I stood up. Not fast, not dramatic, just slowly, deliberately, like the way you reach for a match you've been meaning to light for years. I walked over to the kitchen counter, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a piece of paper I had printed out the night before. A plain black and white sheet, folded in thirds like a letter. I placed it on the table in front of my father, right next to the gravy boat, and said in a voice calm enough to shake the walls, then explained this. You could hear forks drop. My dad blinked once, his head tilting with that confused, irritated look he wore whenever the world didn't immediately bend to his logic. He picked up the paper, unfolded it with one hand, and stared. Janice leaned over his shoulder, trying to make sense of it too, and then she gasped. Sharp, loud, too human to fake. The kind of sound that makes your stomach twist before your brain even catches up. Jake's eyes darted to the paper, and for a second, I could see the twitch in his jaw, the hesitation, the fraction of a second where he wasn't sure whether to lie, to laugh, or to lunge. But he didn't say anything, not yet. It was a screenshot. Just one. A direct message from Jake's Instagram account, dated 8 months ago. The username matched. The message read, "Hey, you looked really cute at the track meet." I didn't want to say anything there because of the parents, but if you ever want to talk. The recipient? A 16-year-old girl. The daughter of Jake's assistant coach. The dinner table felt like it dropped 10 degrees. Melissa, his picture-perfect wife, sat frozen, her fork still halfway to her mouth, her eyes darting between Jake and the paper like she was trying to rewrite the timeline in her head. Danny said Jesus Christ under his breath. Janice's face went pale in that way older women go pale when reality finally elbows its way into the delusion they've clung to for too long. And my father, the man who had just hosted his right child, looked like he'd swallowed a bone. But Jake, oh, Jake, he finally found his voice. "This is fake," he said, lifting the paper like it was coated in disease. "Photoshopped. Anyone could have made this. What kind of sick joke is this, Emily?" I didn't answer. I just stared at him the way you stare at a spider you're deciding whether to crush or let crawl away. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Why would she wait until Christmas dinner to do this? Why not confront him earlier, privately, away from the ham and the holiday cheer? But let me ask you something. What would you have done if your own father humiliated you in front of your entire family? If he'd spent a lifetime praising the son who got away with everything, while ignoring the daughter who had to clean up after the wreckage he never saw, or didn't want to? Have you ever been the invisible one? The afterthought? The one who didn't turn out right? Because if you have, then maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why I waited until we were all seated together, with wine in their glasses and pride in their mouths, before I let the truth rip the room apart. And that was only the first page. The truth, once you have it in your hands, doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes, it just feels like a match you're too scared to light, because deep down you know the fire won't just burn the one who deserves it, it'll scorch everyone close to them, too. And as I stood there watching my father's face contort with something between denial and dread, I felt the weight of that truth settle on my chest like a stone, cold and familiar. But I didn't flinch, not this time. I'd spent too many years swallowing the silence, choking on apologies I never owed, waiting for the moment someone in that family would look at me and actually see the full picture instead of just the corners they liked to frame. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I hadn't just stumbled across that screenshot by accident, nor had I printed it on a whim or for shock value. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't revenge for the sake of vengeance. It was calculated, deliberate, and born from a conversation that never should have happened, but changed everything once it did. It began, ironically enough, 2 weeks earlier, in the middle of a funeral reception for my great-aunt May, the kind of woman who crocheted blankets for strangers and judged everyone who used store-bought pie crust. The service was long, the reception longer, and by the time the wine had settled in and the cheese trays had started to curl, my cousin Tyler, half-drunk and double-bored, slid into the seat next to me and said something that made the back of my neck go cold. He leaned in close, wine glass dangling carelessly from his fingers, and muttered, "Man, Jake's still doing that thing where he messages the young girls on his track team, huh?" His voice was light, almost joking, like it was some harmless quirk or frat boy habit that hadn't aged out of him properly, and I remember blinking at him, my mouth halfway to forming a polite laugh, until the words actually registered. At first, I thought I'd misheard. I asked him to repeat it, and he did same tone, same shrug, as if he were commenting on someone's old car or bad haircut. When I pressed him, asked him what the hell he meant by that, he backtracked a little, claimed he was just repeating stuff he heard, that some of the other parents had been whispering, but by then, the seed had already been planted. I drove home that night in a fog, the echo of that sentence bouncing around in my skull, and by morning, I'd pulled out my laptop and started searching. It started innocent enough, or at least that's what I told myself to justify the intrusion. I looked through Jake's public social media. Nothing too crazy, just harmless photos of team events, birthday posts, some braggy captions about his job and kids. But something about his Instagram struck me, too many likes from girls who looked young, way too young. The kind of girls who still had braces, who took mirror selfies in their locker rooms, who captioned everything with emojis and exclamation points. I checked usernames, followed links, and soon I was scrolling through pages of girls from the local high school's track team, most of whom Jake had coached over the past 3 years. And then I found it. Buried in a comment thread on a birthday post for one of the team captains was a message from Jake. "Casual, too casual. Can't believe you're already 17. Time flies." It wouldn't have raised red flags on its own, maybe, but that was the moment my stomach turned. Because what kind of 39-year-old man leaves public birthday wishes like that to a teenage girl from his team? And how many of those comments had gone unnoticed? I started looking deeper, this time not through public posts, but through old connections, mutuals, and eventually, through a burner account I'd created just for digging. I used it to message a girl I recognized from one of the team photos, someone who had liked a lot of Jake's pictures. I didn't accuse. I just asked if Coach Jake ever messaged her outside of practice. She responded within an hour. "Yeah, why?" That was the crack. After a few exchanges, some nervous, some defensive, some almost relieved, she sent me a screenshot. It was him. No doubt. The same tone, the same grammar quirks, even the same stupid sunglasses in his profile picture. That message, "Hey, you looked really cute at the track meet," was just one of many. I asked her if she'd talked to anyone about it. She said she tried once, but her mom told her not to stir up drama, that Coach Jake was a good guy. She'd dropped it. I didn't. I couldn't. So I asked if I could use the message, told her I wouldn't share her name, wouldn't expose her, just needed the truth to be visible. She hesitated, then said okay. And I printed it. Not just that one message either, others, too, from different girls, all underage, all the same pattern. I put together a small file and stored it, waiting, watching, trying to decide whether I had the guts to bring it to light. Back at dinner, as Jake sat there accusing me of faking evidence, I reached into my bag and pulled out another paper, this time, 3 pages stapled together. "These are from 3 different girls," I said, my voice flat. "I blacked out the names, but they all said you messaged them while they were still on your team. You know what's messed up, Jake? This isn't even all of it." He stood up then, almost knocking his chair over, pointing at me like I was the criminal. "This is insane," he barked. "You've lost it, Em. You need help." But the room wasn't with him anymore. Melissa was staring at the table, not crying, not blinking. Janice had a hand over her mouth. My father still hadn't said a word, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the back of his chair. And then, Melissa finally spoke. Her voice cracked, but it was steady. "That's why you didn't come home last Thanksgiving," she whispered. "You told me it was work, but you weren't at any tournament. I checked your calendar." Jake froze. She turned to me then, her eyes red. "Did you find anything from this year? Anything recent?" I didn't answer, not because I didn't have something, but because I wasn't done yet. There was still more. More screenshots. More receipts. One in particular that would shift everything even further. But I wasn't going to play that card yet. I needed them uncomfortable. I needed the denial to crack on its own. I leaned back, folded my hands, and said, "We're not even halfway through." And the room went silent again. There's something deeply human about watching someone try to hold together a crumbling lie with nothing but pride and panic, especially when that someone has built an entire life out of being untouchable, unshakable, the one everyone else is supposed to admire and emulate. Jake, who had always moved through life with the slick confidence of a man who'd never truly faced consequence, now stood in the dining room of our childhood home, surrounded by people who had worshipped his golden boy glow for years, and looked like he couldn't remember how to breathe. And I'll admit, there was a twisted, quiet satisfaction blooming in my chest as I watched the carefully curated version of him begin to unravel, thread by smug thread. What none of them realized, what not even Melissa, his loyal and once blind wife, could have guessed, was that the screenshot I'd placed on the table, the message that had sent Janice gasping and the room spiraling, was only the opening crack in the foundation. I had more. Much more. Not just messages or vague insinuations, but tangible, time-stamped proof that Jake wasn't the man he claimed to be, not the coach of the year, family first, morally upright older brother everyone had worshipped like he was the second coming of decency. The illusion had been fed for so long it had turned to gospel, but I was about to show them all how paper-thin that gospel really was. Jake stood there stiffly, gripping the back of his chair like it was the only thing keeping him from falling, his eyes darting from face to face as if pleading silently for someone, anyone, to speak up and tell him they didn't believe it. But the silence was louder than any outburst could have been, and the only sound was the faint clinking of silverware still on half-finished plates, the remnants of a dinner that had already turned cold, along with the image of the man they thought they knew. I reached into my bag again, and this time I didn't speak right away. I just laid the second envelope flat on the table, slow and deliberate, letting the weight of it hang in the air like the next line in a eulogy. My fingers trembled slightly, not out of fear, but out of restraint, because what I was holding wasn't just digital proof or indirect evidence, it was something visual, undeniable, and damning in a way even Jake couldn't talk his way out of. I opened the flap, pulled out a set of 3 photographs, and slid them across the table toward Melissa without saying a word. She hesitated, hands trembling as she reached for them, and as her eyes scanned the first image, her breath caught in her throat like she'd been punched. Her lips parted slightly, and I saw the exact moment the recognition hit her. It was Jake's car, his unmistakable silver Dodge Charger, parked in the same high school lot where he claimed he only ever stayed late for paperwork and gear checks. The timestamp in the corner didn't lie. Friday night, 9:30 p.m., 2 days before prom. The second photo was a different angle, same car, same lot, and a very familiar silhouette inside, his head turned toward the passenger seat, lips slightly parted, body language intimate. Too intimate for someone who swore he kept all coach-player interactions professional. Melissa looked up, tears now streaming freely down her cheeks, and in a voice so soft it barely crossed the table, she whispered, "I drove our daughter in that car the next day." And just like that, something shattered in her. Not in the loud, dramatic way television likes to portray, but in the quieter, more devastating way real heartbreak settles, in a collapse that starts small, in the center of the chest, and spreads slowly like ink on linen. Jake finally snapped. "This is insane," he shouted, grabbing the photos and flinging them across the room like they might disappear if he just broke eye contact fast enough. "You think you know what this proves? You think you can just come in here with pictures and screenshots and try to destroy my life because what Dad liked me better?" He turned to our father then, desperation leaking through the cracks in his voice. "Tell them, Dad. Tell them this is all bullshit." But Henry, the man who had raised us with the rigidity of military discipline and the emotional warmth of a brick wall, sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched, his eyes refusing to meet anyone's. It was the first time in my entire life I had seen my father look genuinely uncertain. He wasn't defending Jake. He wasn't defending anyone. He was just sitting there, silent, like a man who'd realized the ship he'd been steering for decades might have been heading for the rocks the whole time. I leaned forward then, my voice low and steady, because I wanted every single word to land. "You want to talk about favoritism, Jake? Let's talk about how you got caught sending pictures to a freshman last spring and Dad made a few phone calls to handle it quietly. Let's talk about the warning letter the school board issued that somehow never made it into your file. You think I didn't know? You think you were careful?" I pulled another folded sheet from my folder and placed it gently next to Jake's untouched wine glass. "Because this says otherwise." The letter, dated from last May, came from the assistant principal's office. It cited a formal concern regarding inappropriate digital communication between staff and students and confirmed that while the issue did not escalate to law enforcement, a written reprimand had been drafted and discussed with the staff member in question, my brother, Jake Allen. The only reason it hadn't gone further was because, according to a note in the margin, parent of staff member advised swift administrative resolution. Parent. Singular. Jake lunged forward, tried to snatch the paper off the table, but I pulled it back before he could touch it. "You can't erase this, Jake," I said, not loud but loud enough. "Not this time." Melissa stood abruptly, chair screeching behind her, eyes red, mascara smeared, and without a single word, she walked out of the dining room, her footsteps sharp against the hardwood floor as she disappeared into the hallway and out the front door. The sound of it slamming shut echoed like a final punctuation mark none of us could ignore. My father finally spoke, but his voice didn't have its usual authority, its clipped precision, or that cold detachment he used like armor. He just said, almost to himself, "This wasn't supposed to come out like this." I turned to him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the child in that room. "You mean it wasn't supposed to come out at all?" I said, watching him flinch ever so slightly, like someone had just reached into the past and pulled out a truth he'd buried alive. And the worst part? We still weren't done. There is a precise moment, so quiet, so heavy, that it doesn't announce itself with shouting or chaos, but rather arrives with a kind of suffocating stillness, where everyone in the room begins to understand that the ground has permanently shifted, that things will not return to normal because the lie they were all standing on has finally cracked open wide enough to swallow them whole. That was the moment we had entered. The air inside the dining room, once scented with cranberry sauce and rosemary glazed ham, now felt thick with something else entirely, something metallic, bitter, and ancient. Like the long-delayed rot of something that had been buried for years and just now clawed its way back to the surface, determined to be seen. Jake was pacing now, his steps uneven, erratic, more animal than man, as though if he kept moving fast enough he could outrun the truth folding in on him from every corner of the house. He was talking, though no one was listening anymore, ranting about character assassination and how I must have hacked into his accounts, as if I were some skilled digital saboteur rather than a woman with a printer and an internet connection. Fueled by the one thing stronger than family loyalty, clarity. My father hadn't said another word, which was notable because silence, in his world, was both a tactic and a confession. He had built his life on the myth of control, but now that myth was unraveling in front of his eyes, and all he could do was grip the edge of the table like it might steady him, like it might keep him from admitting to himself, or worse, to the rest of us, that he had known far more than he'd ever let on. But I wasn't done. What most of them didn't realize, what I had kept buried even from myself, until the final stages of putting the pieces together, was that this wasn't just about the girls, or even about the lies Jake had told to maintain his halo-polished image. This was about a pattern, a legacy of silence and complicity that started long before Jake's first inappropriate message, long before Melissa's confused tears or Janice's pale-faced denial. This went back decades, to when we were still children in this very house, and I was just beginning to learn that my voice didn't carry the same weight as my brother's, that my discomfort was always negotiable, and that my own father was capable of looking me straight in the eye and telling me that what I knew, what I had seen, wasn't real. I turned slowly toward Henry then, not because I needed him to say anything, but because it was time he finally heard what I'd never been allowed to say. The room, still silent, seemed to shrink around us as if even the walls were listening. "You always protected him," I said, my voice low and slow, each word carved deliberately from the stone I'd been carrying in my chest since I was 14. "Even when you knew. Even when I told you." His eyes finally met mine then, and what I saw in them wasn't shock or disbelief, but something worse, recognition. He didn't deny it. He didn't say he didn't remember. He didn't even ask what I meant. He just sat there, his jaw tightening, the muscle twitching the way it always did when he was preparing for a truth he couldn't outmaneuver. I kept going, the words rising now like floodwater after a dam finally breaks. "I came to you crying. You remember that? 14 years old, shaking, terrified, and I told you that Jake had come into my room while you and Mom were at that charity dinner. That he stood in the doorway and asked me if I ever thought about what it would be like to kiss someone older. That he told me not to tell anyone because no one would believe me anyway. And you," I paused, my voice catching just slightly before I forced it back into shape, "you told me that boys go through phases. That maybe I'd misunderstood. That Jake would never do something like that." The room didn't move. No one made a sound. Even Jake had stopped pacing. Janice turned slowly toward my father, her face drawn tight, like she wasn't sure whether to cry or scream. You knew?" she asked, her voice cracked and hoarse. My father didn't answer right away. He looked down at the table, then at me, and said, not with apology, but with something like shame buried beneath a lifetime of denial, "I thought you were confused." I thought. He'd never actually. "You didn't think," I cut in, calm but razor sharp. "You didn't want it to be true, so you made sure it wasn't." I reached for my bag again, the final document already prepared, already printed, already folded and sealed in the same manila envelope I'd kept hidden in my bottom drawer for over 6 months. This one wasn't a screenshot or a photograph. This was something different. Something heavier. I laid it gently on the table in front of him. "This is from the district office," I said quietly, almost reverently, like I was handing over a relic. "Emails between you and the superintendent. You requested that any disciplinary notes regarding Jake be filed under internal coaching evaluation instead of added to his personnel record. You used your reputation, your board membership, your connections to help him skate past every single warning sign." Janice let out a sharp gasp, followed by a sound halfway between a sob and a curse. My father didn't try to deny it. His eyes flickered to the envelope, but he didn't touch it. He looked old then, truly old, like a man who had spent a lifetime building a house from rotten wood and had just realized he was still living inside it. Melissa had come back in by then, holding her phone like a weapon. "I called the school board," she said, her voice firmer now, shaking less. "They're opening a formal investigation. I don't care what your name means in this town, Henry. This ends now." Jake turned to her, panic flashing across his face, reaching out like he could stop this with a single gesture, but she stepped back. "Don't," she said, and in that one syllable, all the years of quiet loyalty, blind trust, and manufactured smiles fell away. And still, I wasn't smiling. I wasn't triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated or powerful. I just felt done. Not done in the way people say after a long day, but done in the way you feel when you've finally pulled the knife out of a wound and realize it's not bleeding anymore, not because it's healed, but because there's nothing left to bleed. I pushed back my chair, stood slowly, looked at each of them in turn, Jake, pale and furious, Melissa, hollow and brave, Janice, shattered, and Henry, defeated, and said, not with anger, but with a kind of tired resolve, "You said only one of your kids turned out right. Maybe that's true, but you picked the wrong one." And with that, I turned and walked out of the dining room, past the tree still blinking in the corner, past the half-wrapped presents and the untouched dessert, and into the cold December air where, for the first time in years, I could finally breathe. But as the door shut behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still hadn't surfaced, that this wasn't the end. Not yet. There are silences that feel like peace, soft, earned, the kind you get after an honest conversation, a warm meal, or the last note of a well-played song, and then there are silences that sit heavy in the chest, coiled like something waiting to strike. The kind that come not after resolution, but after rupture. As I walked to my car that night, the air sharp with December's breath and the smell of smoke wafting from nearby chimneys, I realized that what I felt wasn't victory, not even satisfaction, but something closer to stillness after impact. The eerie calm that follows when the car has already rolled off the highway, the glass has shattered, the airbags have burst, and you're just sitting there wondering how the hell it happened so fast, and why it didn't happen sooner. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before turning the key, my breath fogging up the window, my hands resting in my lap like I didn't quite remember what they were for. I could still hear the echo of Melissa's voice calling the school board, the rustle of Henry opening that final envelope, the stunned sound of Janice realizing she'd spent half a marriage looking away from something that had been pressed to her nose all along. And Jake had stood there, silent for once, not out of dignity or remorse, but because his arsenal had finally run dry. No excuses. No damage control. No father standing behind him ready to smooth over the cracks. But if there's one thing I've learned about people like Jake, it's that silence doesn't mean surrender, it means retreat, recalibration, the careful stacking of the next lie. And I knew him well enough to know that this wasn't over, not really, because men like him don't just vanish quietly into consequence. They smolder, they strategize, and when they come back, it's with the smug delusion that if they say it didn't happen loud enough, someone out there will believe them. Still, that night I let myself believe for just a few quiet minutes that the damage was done and the reckoning had landed. I drove home in the dark, the roads mostly empty, the holiday lights strung across porches flashing through my windshield like flickers of a world still pretending everything was fine. Sophie had fallen asleep at my sister-in-law's house hours earlier, and for that, I was grateful. She didn't need to see what had unfolded. Not yet. She didn't need to witness how generational rot looks when it's dragged screaming into the light. I'd tell her when she was older, old enough to understand the difference between loyalty and silence, between forgiveness and enabling. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight slicing through the blinds, a rare clear sky in the middle of a Midwestern winter, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the immediate jolt of anxiety clawing at my stomach. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop, not to dig, not to build a case, but just to breathe. That feeling lasted precisely 26 minutes. At exactly 9:38, my phone buzzed with a notification. Unknown number. One message. You think it's over. It's not. Just 6 words. No context. No name. But I didn't need either. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I didn't understand, but because I understood it too well. It was Jake. Of course it was. The man who couldn't admit fault, couldn't survive without a fan club, couldn't stand the idea that someone, anyone, had finally stood up and taken the spotlight he'd hogged for 4 decades. It would have been easier to delete the message, block the number, pretend the story had wrapped itself in a neat little bow and that the worst was over. But I couldn't. Because the truth is, stories like this don't end when the confrontation does. They echo. They infect. They mutate in the silence that follows. I called Melissa first, not because I needed reassurance, but because she deserved to know what was coming. Her voice was calmer than I expected, low and tired, like someone who had spent the night walking through the rubble of her own marriage and had come out on the other side with nothing left to give. She told me she was staying with her sister, that she'd already begun speaking to a lawyer, and that she was considering going public if the school board tried to sweep it under the rug again. I told her about the message. She didn't sound surprised. He won't let it go, she said. He's never let anything go. Later that afternoon, I drove by my parents' house, not to go inside, not to speak to anyone, but just to see if anything had changed. It hadn't. The decorations were still up, the lights still blinking in the windows, a wreath still hanging perfectly on the door like nothing inside had exploded just hours earlier. And maybe that was the most fitting metaphor of all, outside, everything neat and curated, inside, an entire system cracked down the middle. I never heard from my father again, not directly. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. His handwriting unmistakable, clean, sharp, distant. It wasn't an apology. Of course it wasn't. It was a defense. A long, exhausting letter filled with rationalizations and justifications and lines like, "You never understood the pressure I was under, and I always tried to protect both of you in my own way, and I thought I was doing what was best for the family." But nowhere in the entire 4 pages, did he say the word sorry. Not once. Because people like Henry Allen don't say sorry. They explain. They justify. They defend their choices as necessary, inevitable, even noble. At the very end of the letter, though, there was a sentence that stopped me cold. "You've always been too emotional, Emily. That's your weakness." I folded the letter, tucked it back into the envelope, and slid it into the drawer beside the printouts I hadn't yet destroyed. Because maybe someday, when Sophie asks about the fire her mother started at Christmas dinner, I'll show her all of it, not to relive the trauma, not to point fingers, but to teach her what happens when you finally decide that silence is no longer an option, and that being called too emotional by a man who chose silence over truth is, in fact, the highest compliment you can receive. And still, I can't pretend there isn't a small part of me that wonders, what if I'd kept it quiet? What if I'd just let the toast go unchallenged, let Jake bask in his moment, let the lie live one more year? Would anything have changed? Would the girls he messaged have ever spoken out? Would Melissa have ever known what kind of man she was married to? Would Henry have ever faced the cost of his silence? I'll never know. What I do know is this: sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it burns your house down. And all you can do is walk out the front door, covered in ash, and not look back. But even now, months later, every time my phone buzzes unexpectedly, every time I walk past a silver charger in a parking lot, every time I look at my daughter and think about what it means to raise a girl in this world, I remember those 6 words. You think it's over. It's not. And the worst part is, I believe him.